Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. It's a pleasure for me to see you again, full room, as it should be this morning. Wonderful weather and a special day for us that we'll spend together. All students of this solid promotion, the participants to the pilot project of the European Diplomatic Academy. I guess you're already mixed, otherwise this day will be one occasion more to get to know each other and spend the day together. We will start the day in, I think, the best possible manner. And that is by trying to understand what we're going to see this afternoon, the Flanders Fields, the roots of what Europe has become today, just a little bit more than a century ago. Let me say that I am particularly pleased that we have this conference this morning, making sense of the Great War a century onwards. And I would like to thank Professor LAGROU for joining us and sharing with us his knowledge about this. I would like to just say two things about this morning session. First of all, that I believe that it is extremely important to study history and to read history, to focus on history. Not always you do this in the course of your master programs here, but I would encourage you to do so as many times as you have the possibility to do so, either in your courses or privately. Because personally, I'm convinced that through history, you understand a lot of what is happening today. The dynamics, even the geopolitical context is as much linked to history as of geography. And I think that if we want to understand who we are, where we come from, is where we have to look at. And also, if we want to understand where others stands today, why certain behaviors, personal, collective, or institutional ones, you often need to go back and look at the history of peoples, communities, states, institutions, the world dynamics over the course of the centuries. This is my personal conviction, and this is why I'm so pleased that today we'll have actually a double occasion. This morning to focus on the history of what we will visit this afternoon, and then this afternoon we will touch it. And this is the second thing I will say. Studying and having conferences like we're having this morning is very important to frame it. It's very important to deepen your knowledge. But I think that seeing the places where history happened, realizing how people lived and how the drama happens in real terms, will give you a different kind of perspective on things that you might know, you might learn this morning, but feeling them somehow will be a different thing. For me, the first time I went to visit the Flanders Fields, I think I felt that I was finally grasping for real the distance we have gone from being Europe, the place that was the center of conflict worldwide for centuries, actually for thousands of years. We have been the place where peoples have been fighting each other, even from very far away. You will see and you will hear how it involved people coming from as far as Australia and New Zealand. That at that time was quite something. We moved from being the continent where war was lived in the entire world and exported to being the most advanced project of political integration in human history, the European Union. And this is just less than 100 years. So how the power of political determination and will can move things. And that there is no destiny, actually. It's all about decisions and implementation of decisions. I'll stop here because I'm very much eager to listen to the conference this morning. I'll stay with you as much as I can. Again, I wish you a very fruitful morning, a very pleasant and fruitful visit this afternoon. We'll be together the entire day. And again, I would like to thank Professor for sharing with us his thoughts this morning. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, very much. It's a great honor for me to be here in this place and at this special occasion. And I hope that I will be able to share with you some thoughts on what you will be seeing this afternoon. I'm used to talking for 2 hours on end, so I should not do this. I will try to stick to about an hour and make sure that we can maybe have an exchange afterwards. I hope to be provocative enough to provoke you into responding. Let's start with a bit of poetry. I'm not sure I can read this. No, I can do this. Okay. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard, amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, fell dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. The poppies are a cultural emblem of British culture, symbol of veterans, symbol of solidarity with veterans and disabled soldiers of all Britain's wars, sold on the 11th of November all through the kingdom. The war poets are also icons of popular culture, but it's important to underline that they are emblems of popular culture because they are emblems of official policy. The war poets and in Flanders Fields, the poppies blow is a poem all British school kids know by heart. Now, since Brexit, I guess there is not a single British student here, or would they? Okay. So I should have invited you to recite this, but I'm by heart. Well, indeed, they are taught in school, unless you contradict me. They are taught in school because they are promoted as a cornerstone of an officially enshrined national identity. The poppies and Flanders Fields, this is very much what Britain is about. So, quite logically, David Cameron, who went on to have less fortunate ideas about European identity just a couple of years later, in 2012, David Cameron decided to earmark 50 million pounds to make sure that every single British school child could go to Flanders Fields to discover the sites of the war poets and somehow the birth of a peculiar British identity. Flanders Fields, the Ypres salient, occupy a very special place in British memory because this is where the bulk of the British army was engaged. This is where the highest number of British casualties fell, and the Ypres salient became in many ways a British site of memory, to the point that at the end of the war, when the city of Ypres and its surroundings were totally shot to ruins in scenes remindful of what we would now see on the Donbass front, not a single brick was standing. There was an official demand by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to leave it as such. Ypres would become the monument to the folly of war and to the martyrdom of Great Britain and the Commonwealth in this war. Now, this was, of course, very much not what the locals thought. For them, Ypres was not a Commonwealth war grave. For them, Ypres was their home, and they just wanted to go back home and rebuild Ypres as it stood. So here we had a very complex conflict of ownership. Who owned this site? The locals were convinced that they owned it and they had all the necessary documents to prove it. The Commonwealth thought that they well deserved ownership of this place because of the sacrifice. And so a very complex negotiation started between the Commonwealth, the government in Brussels, and the locals, in which, in the end, and maybe that was the best outcome. The locals won. The locals won, but still, even today, Ypres has somehow a status of extraterritoriality. And so here we have Cameron's grand designs. The Menin Gate, where the names of the thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers from the Commonwealth who died in the Ypres salient are engraved, where I think you will witness the last post tonight, is that right? So the Menin Gate is somehow part of the Commonwealth, or certainly of the United Kingdom. You are no longer in Belgium when you go there. The last post is organized by a private association on which neither the municipality of Ypres nor the Flemish or the Belgian government have anything to say. By the way, British tourism to Ypres is a tourism of a special kind. It is, in many ways, a celebration of British national values. What is celebrated in Ypres? Well, is some of those other vulgarly commercial icons of British culture. It is a specific British spirit of endurance, stoicism, fighting spirit. It symbolizes somehow the duty of Britain to save those hysterical continental Europeans from themselves time and again. Therefore, going to Ypres or sending hundreds of thousands of British school kids to Ypres is not especially to instill a European spirit in the British youth, not to promote pacifism, but very definitely to promote Britishness. Britain, like Russia, seems to suffer from an excess of war memories. That is, an excess of patriotic war memories, that is. And this then also leads, especially in Britain, to the conflation of two war experiences. Basically, the Second World War is the First World War all over again. And this is a picture of a demonstration by British patriots, by white supremacists who have blocked the A20 highway into Dover to protest against the invasion of refugees crossing the Channel. And these British white supremacists, I think we can say without any hesitation, these British fascists, were referring to Britain's battles, and especially to the Blitz. They were singing, there were 10 German bombers in the air. You probably know this. There were 10 German bombers in the air. There were 10 German bombers in the air, etc. And the RAF shot down one, and then the RAF shot down two. Now, so this is a song celebrating British resistance during the Blitz. That is British resistance against Nazism. This is British resistance at a time when Britain had become a safe haven for hundreds of thousands of anti-Nazi refugees from the continent. So this patriotic memory can very easily be turned to absolutely opposite uses. Okay, so war memories. We shouldn't congratulate ourselves. The more we have of them, the better they are. We can have too much war memories, and they can be put to the wrong kind of uses. Now, the announcement that hundreds of thousands of British school kids would cross the Channel and travel to Ypres, that is, not just to Flanders Fields. Those Flanders Fields are, after all, a tiny bit of the territory, really in this upper corner next to the French border, was of course treated in Flanders, and especially in the region of the Westhoek, as a huge commercial opportunities. These kids were going to sleep there, they were going to eat there, and they were going to buy souvenirs. So this was an opportunity not to be missed. It was also a major logistical challenge. There was clearly a sense of panic in the regional and in the Flemish authorities. We had to build parking lots for school buses quickly, because this was going to create havoc. So you will be able, I'm sure, to enjoy huge parking lots built for hundreds of thousands of British school kids. But it was, of course, also a political window of opportunity for the Flemish government. Now, the constitutional architecture of Belgium is highly complex, but you have to know that everything that has to do with cultural policies and heritage sites is the exclusive realm of the Flemish government, of the regional Flemish government, and so not of the Belgian national government. So there was a very ambitious project of the centennial of the First World War, where the Flemish government would do a big deal of auto-promotion, trying to put itself on the map of geopolitics as a sovereign state. And to do so, they had the grand idea of promoting a declaration in Flanders Fields, because this British cultural icon of the poppies in Flanders Fields was, of course, something that should be used and put to good usage by the Flemish authorities too. And so the grand idea was that in 2014, the Flemish government would invite governments worldwide of all those nations who had participated in the Great War to come to Ypres and sign a solemn declaration, which reads out as follows. We commit ourselves to this Flanders Fields Declaration, a solemn pledge to uphold the memory of the Great War fought 100 years ago here in Flanders Fields and throughout Europe and the rest of the world. As the generation of direct witnesses of the First World War gently fades away, we owe to the 40 million casualties and the many more whose course of life was indelibly marked by the war to uphold remembrance of this cataclysmic event. The First World War, unchained by an ill-fated series of incidents and alliances, led to an unprecedented loss of lives amongst the military and the civilian population, devastation at a scale never seen before, a radical change in warfare and the development of new atrocious weapons and techniques. Young men from all parts of the world came to die on Flanders battlefields, war cemeteries with endless lines of graves, sweepingly altered landscapes and city centers, and vast amounts of ammunition still concealed in peaceful-looking fields testify to this day of the magnitude of the war. Yet the Great War also marked the beginning of the modern era. The massive sacrifices demanded of the entire population made it impossible to ignore its legitimate claims for democratization of our societies. Well, there's a little blip here in my slide. Despite its shortcomings, the peace that ended the war bore the beginnings of the modern law of nations, characterized by permanent international institutions, the right of self-determination of all peoples, common solutions to social questions, human rights, and the quest for disarmament. War, armed conflict, atrocious weapons, terrible suffering by civilians, and large-scale devastations are still not eradicated from today's world. We are convinced that the answers to these wrongs remain the same: the international rule of law, intense cooperation amongst nations, disarmament, and regional integration. As age-old hatreds and rivalries has been vanquished and international cooperation has dimmed the scars brought by the Great War, we commemorate 11 November, Day of the Armistice, as a day to preserve the remembrance of all victims from all sides, from all wars. Reaffirm our belief in humanity's ability to overcome its divisions, to unite, and hence to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I will spare you the rest of this declaration, but I thought it was important to show it to you because if you are curious, that was a spoiler. If you are curious enough to check this, you will try to find it on the internet. You won't find it, because this declaration very soon became a major embarrassment for the Flemish government. The Flemish government had, of course, projected that there they would be sitting among heads of states of sovereign nations, what they thought themselves to be, but the polite rebuke came instantly from London and Paris that might be a nice idea, but at first, if they wanted to sign this kind of declarations, they could invite the regional governments of Wales or the Hauts-de-France, but in no way the national government. National governments deal with national governments, so your declaration, no thank you. And by the way, Britain and France have their armies engaged on different battlefronts all through the world. So an unqualified condemnations of the scourge of war and a quite naive appeal to disarmament is not something the British or the French government are ready to sign. So this was indeed a major embarrassment, and it became in many ways a Flemish joke. It revealed to which extent these new nations, and in that regard it's interesting to see that a government like the Flemish government and its administration is almost as recent as those of, say, the Baltic countries or many other new nations who have the idea, and for those who have some notions of Dutch, the slogan of the Flemish nationalist movement and of the Flemish government was, "Wat we zelf doen, doen we beter." What we do ourselves, we do it better than that corrupt, old-fashioned national Belgian state. Well, that isn't exactly how it works. They simply miss expertise, and they are also characterized by deep mistrust of intellectual elites, and very especially of academic historians, whom they all suspect to be new Belgians, nieuwe Belgen, some kind of liberal cosmopolitan elites who have broken with local nationalism and go so far as to grow nostalgic of this multicultural, multilingual, old-fashioned Belgian state. That's something that we can find back in other initiatives, including in the project, and again, all new nations in Europe, from the Baltic to almost the Balkans, have been expected to build a Holocaust memorial or a Holocaust museum. So, of course, the Flemish government also wanted to show that no, Flemish nationalists were not all anti-Semite fascist nostalgics, but they too had their own Holocaust museum. Well, the story of this Holocaust museum is again rooted in mistrust of cosmopolitan, liberal, Flemish-hating Flemish academics. So this was very much a total failure. But it was still interesting for the choice that was made, because in a quite unexpected way, the Flemish government decided to throw into the dustbin a carefully cultivated narrative of the Great War as the birthplace of Flemish nationalism. Flemish nationalism was born, well, and here the story becomes a little bit more complicated. It was born in the trenches, of course. Flemish soldiers retreated behind the Iser River, and in the trenches they fought heroically, but they died in great numbers because their commanding officers were speaking French, and they did not understand French, so by just simply misunderstanding the orders, they were shot down by the Germans. So there was structural injustice. The officers represented the bourgeoisie, the upper classes, the soldiers were poor Flemish, non-Francophone, and so they were famously the cannon fodder of this great war. And from this experience started Flemish emancipation. Most historians have for a long time shown that this is mostly myth-making, not corresponding to realities, but still this has for a very long time been a story of martyrdom, as we can find in most European new nations. More embarrassingly, so we had this front movement of Flemish soldiers who rebel against Francophone officers. That was only a tiny part of the birth of the Flemish movement. Much more prominently, there was what was called the activisten, that is, those Flemish militants who lived in the by far biggest part of the Belgian territory and who were, in a way, manipulated by the German occupier into Flemish activism. It is the German occupier who created the Dutch-speaking only University of Ghent, who created the administrative separation. So finally, well, the Flemish movement was in good part invented by the Germans. The same is true, by the way, for Latvia or Lithuania and many other places in Europe. Many of these micro-nationalisms were simply a German invention. And of course, the Entente powers tried very much to do the same, and we could say to some extent that Czech nationalism or Polish nationalism, Arab nationalism and Zionism were also put to different uses by the Entente powers to weaken their enemies. So here we see a set of stories of the instrumentalization of Great War memories at the occasion of the centennial. But what lessons does the Great War hold for Europe in this early 21st century? And how can we extrapolate these debates and controversies to the whole of Europe? Indeed, Ypres is a peculiar place, a place that is somehow both British and Flemish, and both Brits and Flemish have tried to put it to peculiar uses. But what about the legacy of the Great War in the new Europe, the Europe of now 27 member states? It's interesting to see that, yes, indeed, the Great War has also been the object of reinterpretations in Eastern Europe. And I will just quote one Polish historian, Andrzej Nowak, who is, say, a nationalist, conservative historian, quite close to the current PiS government, and who is very active in one of those many networks set up by the European Union and lavishly financed by European money. The one I'm referring to now is, for instance, this European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity. So in the middle of the wave of centennial celebrations, Andrzej Nowak came to Brussels to deliver a lecture, where he also mentioned the Great War. But of course, these networks and historians from Poland, the Baltic countries, partly also other European countries like Hungary, are entering the fray of the battle for European remembrance with a different agenda. They are not so much obsessed by the First World War as they are with the Second World War. And there is very clearly a concerted effort by, say, the new nationalists in Central and Eastern Europe to somehow overturn the ideological hegemony of cosmopolitan liberals who have posited so centrally the 27th of January, that is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to try to replace it by an alternative commemorative date, that is the 23rd of August, Black Ribbon Day, and that is basically to say, no, the Holocaust is not the central and the first crime. The central and the first crime is the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Treaty and the division of Poland and of the Baltic countries. This is where it all started. And somehow the Holocaust is collateral damage to this first transgression. So we have to displace the cursor, we have to change the commemorative agenda of the European Union to make sure that East European experiences also get their share of the attention. International Holocaust Remembrance Day, after all, is a ritual occasion for Pole bashing or Lithuanian bashing or Latvian bashing. Let's try to replace this by a different agenda where, by the way, Stalin, Soviet Union, and thus indirectly Russia, are put on equality, on equal footing with Hitler. But, so here we see this concerted effort. But in this effort, there is also a mention of the Great War. It's important to show that, well, when the Law and Justice Party came to power, they were faced with an entirely new infrastructure, say memorial infrastructure in Poland. Obviously, after the fall of communism in Poland in 1989, the memory infrastructure in Poland, as in so many other former Soviet bloc countries, was very much that of Soviet-style anti-fascism. So it was a central challenge to replace this Soviet-style anti-fascism memory infrastructure by new memory infrastructures. And it should be stressed that Poland especially was spectacularly successful in doing so, much more so than countries like Latvia, Lithuania, or Hungary, which created monuments and musea which are, to a large extent, an embarrassment and a shame. Putting all the stress, there is the Lithuanian Genocide Museum. I reassure you, this is not mentioning the fate of Jews, but the fate of Lithuanians under the first and the second Soviet occupation. Not so in Poland. Poland managed to create ambitious and innovative musea, some of the very best musea, history musea in Europe, one being the Second World War Museum in Gdansk, the most ambitious Europe-wide, the most inventive museum on the history of the Second World War, the second being the Polin in Warsaw, a museum not, as so many other museums, focusing on the killing of Jews in Europe, but on the contribution of Jewish life during 1,000 years in Europe. One of the first things the new government did was to oust the people in charge of these musea. Pavel Makiewicz in Gdansk, Dariusz Stola in Poland, in the Polin, and to try to replace them with new directors, but also try to replace this commemorative agenda they accused again of being taken hostage by liberal cosmopolitans in the pay of Berlin and Brussels, with also a central attack against the House of European History in Brussels, which you might have seen. The House of European History in Brussels for the PiS government's Minister of Culture was an apology of the Homo Sovieticus, nothing less than that. But so let's try to change the software and let's try to promote a properly patriotic memory. And so in this framework, the Great War also needed to be revisited. And Andrzej Nowak, who contributes to the organization of a Congress of Conservative Historians, whatever that might be, we just know that those liberal cosmopolitans are not invited, or even if they are invited, they prefer not to show up, because at the end, there is the Kaczynski Prize of History that is being awarded. Well, people like Nowak and his school say, well, basically there is a profound discrepancy between the way the Great War is remembered and interpreted in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. We have on the one hand the New Europe, we have the Old Europe, we have the East, we have the West. And what is the difference? Well, basically in Western Europe, the main message that is promoted after the First World War is one, well, along the terms of this in Flanders Fields Declaration, one of pacifism, disarmament, cosmopolitanism, friendship among the nations, international cooperation, in short, decadence. In the East, in the New Europe, it is about patriotism, it is about fighting spirit, and we still have that fighting spirit. Don't count on us to buy your pacifist, mooly-wooly discourses on nie wieder, on lader, dader, deder, the war to end all wars. Now, coming from a Pole, this is of course a little bit surprising, because maybe Polish soldiers showed their fighting spirit during the Great War, but they did so in 3 different armies. In the German army, in the Austro-Hungarian army, and in the Russian army. And it so happens that all 3 of them somehow lost the war. So how can we celebrate the fighting spirit of Polish soldiers during the Great War if they were basically fighting against their own nation? Well, that is of course because what is celebrated is the rebirth of the nation after the war had made this possible. It's interesting that these kinds of reinterpretations are also part of, one could say, a conservative revolution all over Europe, and that there are some common points between the white supremacists in Dover in September 2020 and the kind of discourses promoted by Novak. I remember witnessing his lecture in 2015. This was just a few months after the terrorist attacks in Brussels. And continuing on his central theme of the incompatibility of memories east and west of Europe, he said, well, indeed, if Western Europe doesn't really care about Stalinist crimes, we don't really care about the crimes of colonialism, and don't count on us to take any form of moral or political responsibility for what are still the collateral effects of your colonial crimes, that is, the refugee crisis. You guys are now bargaining hard and tough to make sure that Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries take their share of refugees. This is none of our business. You created this mess in your colonies. You take care of the consequences of this also. Going one step further and saying, you very well understand that we don't want these guys in our countries who put bombs in your metro stations and your airports. We don't want Muslims in our countries because, let's not hide it, it's Muslims who commit terrorist attacks. Have you ever seen a Buddhist or a Hindu committing terrorist attacks? Now, on this point, Andrei Novak seemed to suggest that a little bit of world history won't do no harm, and it would have helped him to study the vast extent and extreme violence of Hindu terrorism in India. Well, what is celebrated behind the experience of the Great War, where basically the new countries were absent because non-existent, is their rebirth, is the unlikely success stories that 3 Baltic countries gained independence, even though almost nobody in Riga or certainly not in Vilnius would have expected this in 1914 and probably not even in 1917. The spectacular rebirth of a huge Poland, so big that it ended up encompassing 30%, 1/3 of minority populations, the huge expansion of Romania, and the strange construction of 2 countries, one called Yugoslavia and the other called Czechoslovakia, one being, say, Greater Serbia under another name, the other being Greater Bohemia Moravia under another name. They celebrate their rebirth, but they go beyond this and they also celebrate the myth of a golden age. They reach self-determination and they finally become democracies. They become democracies until Stalin ruins it all. That's a bit short as a story. We very well know that democracy didn't last long in any of these new countries, except Czechoslovakia, that is, but then Czechoslovakia was sacrificed on the altar of the Munich agreements. And so, after the Second World War, the story is quite different. The Baltic countries, again, are integrated in the Soviet Union. Poland doesn't really become smaller, but is massively shifted westwards. Romania is reduced, and by the end of the 20th century, both Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia have disappeared. So there is some reason for them to celebrate 1919 rather than 1945. Of course, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece have much less reason to celebrate 1919, especially for Hungary. Trianon is a national trauma, a moment of dismemberment and humiliation. And in the end, only Turkey is a country that was humiliated under Sèvres in 1919, and then manages to turn the tables, to come back to the negotiations in Lausanne in 23, and to renegotiate peace on its own terms. And it is in this regard that Mustafa Kemal becomes a model and an inspiration for nationalists of dismembered nations all over Europe, and very especially for Adolf Hitler. If Mustafa Kemal can make it in 1923, why wouldn't we? Okay, so the interpretation of the Great War is at the core of memory battles and of retrospective illusions in many parts in Europe, with, of course, different implications. But what about interpreting the Great War since this other watershed event that happened on the 24th of February this year? How do we read the Great War in the light of the war in Ukraine? We can only, of course, be struck by the similarities. Until the return of Blitzkrieg just 10 days ago and fast-moving conquest by the Ukrainian army, this was very much 1914 all over again. This was very much the Ypres salient. Trench warfare, literally digging trenches, massive amount of artillery, shells being fired by the hundreds of thousands, so much so that stocks were depleted and that Russia is now reduced to importing North Korean shells. Just imagine the amount of shells that have been fired. But of course also the impact on the bodies of soldiers. And we are not just talking about shell shock, we are talking about mutilation, we are talking about the loss of limb. We will again live in Russia and in Ukraine the scenes that were so characteristic of European societies after 1918, that is, disabled soldiers by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, with missing legs, with missing arms, etc. So, yes, indeed, in many ways it is the return of the Great War. But it seems that there is also another lesson to be drawn, probably even more important for us. Why is the Ukrainian army so highly successful? They have a massive amount of very high-tech modern American weapons, and they have massive access to American intelligence. That's the reason. Not really. Let's not remember that the Afghan official government, that the Afghan army, has received more than $2 trillion in American military and economic aid, that they dispose of the most modern military equipment and all the intelligence that was available to the American troops who had been stationed there for 20 years. Now that helped them to last for about 48 hours. So the answer is not American weaponry and not American intelligence. Of course, they are indispensable, but they are very obviously not a sufficient condition for military resilience. So where does the astounding resilience and fighting spirit of the Ukrainian army come from? And this very clearly leads us to what has been the dominant historiographical debate, especially in France, on the interpretation of the Great War. For the last quarter century, two schools have fought many battles on the interpretation of the Great War. The one school is, say, the school of constraint. How did millions of soldiers endure the atrocious conditions in the trenches, seeing their comrades being shot to pieces, living in mud, cold among the rats and the corpses, rotting corpses? How did they endure? One answer is, it's discipline, it's sheer repression. As soon as there were mutinies, soldiers were shot, for example. So if you want to understand why soldiers remained there rather than walking home. This is the explanation. And it's important to know, rather than walking home, this happened, of course. What explains the Russian Revolution? It is 3,500,000 Russian soldiers just walking home because the Russian army was no longer capable of keeping this kind of discipline. What, in a way, and I speak under the control of Italian colleagues, what explains the rise of fascism? Well, it is especially Caporetto, the fact that indeed at some point in 1917, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers threw away their guns and just walked home. So indeed, the Italian army couldn't do it, the Russian army couldn't do it, but modern armies had sufficient discipline to make sure their soldiers stayed there. The second school says that is not totally false, but it's not a full story. What counted most especially is consent, patriotic consent. The soldiers believed they were fighting for a good cause. And by the way, the mutinies were not mutinies against the war, were mutinies, very focused mutinies on military decisions by the general staff that was absolutely wasting human lives of soldiers. It was because of useless sacrifice, wrong tactics, not because the war in itself was wrong. The war, well, it's something to die for, something worth dying for, and it just so seems that if you are on the defensive, it's easier to believe this than if you are attacking. The legitimacy of French soldiers and Belgian soldiers on French and Belgian soil was stronger than that of German and Austrian soldiers in foreign lands, just as the motivation of Russian soldiers today could be and seems to be quite weaker than that of Ukrainians defending their land. So something to die for. By the way, often in inventive ways. Soldiers who died on the battlefield receive an inscription on their gravestone in France, Mort pour la France. But what do British soldiers die for? For king and country. Oh, that's quite smart, whatever that country is. So it could be England, it could be Scotland. It was for quite a few of them, Ireland, which went on to have its Irish Revolution. So, including in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, well, loyalty went to the emperor, and one could believe to be fighting for Bohemia, Moravia, and the king, and not for an empire that was described by others as a prison of peoples. So, yes, patriotic consent, believing in a just cause, might be decisive in modern warfare, no less in 2022 than in 2014, or in 1914 or 1918. And very interesting studies have been conducted on not just the front and the army, but on the rear. And there is this great series, Capital Cities at War, directed by Jean-Louis Robert and Jay Winter. And they compare London, Paris, Berlin, and one of the conclusions they reach is, in a way, counterintuitive. That is, well, democracies are better at waging wars than authoritarian dictatorships. Because indeed, there is a degree of patriotic consent, and we all know that the machinery at the rear in Imperial Germany, starting in 1917, was starting to encounter serious problems of patriotic consent at the rear in the civilian population. So, what if indeed democracies are better at waging war than authoritarian regimes? This again is one conclusion we could draw from the experience of the Great War that is maybe partially contradicted by the Second World War, because who won, and let's be honest, almost single-handedly the Second World War? Well, it is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not a model democracy in 1941 or in 1945. But still, the Soviet Union was being attacked ferociously by Nazi Germany and the Great Patriotic War, so dear to Vladimir Putin, was indeed seen, experienced as a fight for survival, as a fight for the survival of the Soviet nation in all its multiplicities. And in this regard, of course, the Great Patriotic War today is fought by the Ukrainians and not by the Russians, in spite of what Putin would say about this. Now, to come to a conclusion, what does all this say about the place World War I and World War II occupy in putative genealogies of the European Union of today? Very clearly, for the last 70 years, European integration has been portrayed as a sequel, as the outcome, and as the logical conclusion of the Second World War. Now, that is probably, in the Europe of 2022, a problematic story and a problematic genealogy. Why is that? Because, of course, European integration as an outcome of 1945 is a very Western story. It is a story of exclusion and betrayal, very, very starkly felt in places like Warsaw, Prague, Vilnius, or Riga. Your European integration is your betrayal of our freedom and our right to self-determination. By the way, isn't the story that European integration corresponds to the lessons drawn from the Second World War in many ways a pious myth? European integration, as it started in the early 1950s with coal and steel and went on to be formalized in the Treaty of Rome, took place in the absence of a peace treaty. There was never any peace treaty with Germany. Germany was dismembered and recreated. European community of steel, coal and steel was not part of a grand design for disarmament. We very well know it had everything to do with rearmament. It was because of Korea. It was because of the Cold War. It was because of relaunching the capacities to produce heavy weapons. And so, indeed, it is a pious myth, and we might even say that Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Rome are, in a way, the outcomes of opposite illusions. The Treaty of Versailles has been harshly criticized because it unilaterally attributes the blame and the historical responsibility for the outbreak of the war to Germany and to Germany alone. And most historians agree that indeed the history of the first years of the 20th century are quite more complex than that, and we cannot reduce blame to Germany alone. The Treaty of Rome doesn't mention the issue of historical responsibility. And it does as if the Second World War was just a fratricidal war, and the only thing we have to do is to reunite with the Germans. This time, the question of responsibility was absolutely clear. And the illusion behind, in a way, the Treaty of Rome, that is, there was no culprit. There was no accountability, while accountability was center staged in Versailles. And in the end, this small Europe of the Treaty of Rome was no more than the outcome of a very brutal peace. A brutal peace signed in Potsdam in July 1945. Now, what was Potsdam? Potsdam was confirming the division of the continent signed in Yalta between mainly Churchill and Stalin, and drawing new borders in a very different way than had been done in Versailles. Versailles drew new borders, but negotiators in Versailles were acutely aware that there were no good borders, or that any border would create new minorities. The central decision of the architecture of Versailles was that minorities would be protected. New borders were assorted with minority treaties, and the League of Nations was supposed to be the guardian of the minority treaties. What was decided in Potsdam? The deportation and the expropriation of minorities. To start with 14 million Germans, but including also Poles and Ukrainians, including also Hungarians and many, many more. So this is, in a way, what the Treaty of Rome was built upon. So can we still continue to celebrate European integration as simply a conclusion of the Second World War and the brutal peace and the division of Europe that it caused? Shouldn't we somehow return to Versailles? Versailles has been blamed for all the evils of the 20th century. If we had a Second World War, it's because of Versailles. I mean, just out of curiosity, who here has ever tried to read the Treaty of Versailles? Oh, okay. Now you will. You will tell me as soon as I finish in 2 minutes what your reading of the Treaty of Versailles is. Versailles is a grand idea. Versailles is a properly utopian text. Versailles is about self-determination. Versailles is about democracy. And Versailles is about social rights. There is an entire part of the Versailles Treaty that deals exclusively with social rights, including the right to equal pay for men and women. We're still some way off from what has been written in the Versailles Treaty. It is about the 8-hour working day. It is about paid holidays. It is about the creation of the International Labour Office. It is the idea that you can't have a working democracy and you can't have peace in Europe without social justice. Where was social justice in 1945? And I'd even dare to say, where was social justice in Rome in the 1950s? So, yes, Versailles was inclusive. Versailles was utopian. And it was the promise of democracy and self-determination for all European nations, including, that is, Ukraine. Should we continue to celebrate the small Europe of the 1950s, or should we simply change the format and return to the grand designs of Versailles? The small Europe of the 1950s was geographically small. It was just 6 small nations in Western Europe, and it was based on the betrayal and exclusion of Eastern and Central Europe, something they rightfully resent. But it was also singularly lacking in ambition. It was about free trade. It was not about democracy. It was not about human rights, in spite of what has been pretended ever since. The European communities had nothing to do with human rights. That was the Council of Europe. It's a different treaty. It's a different institution. So quite naturally, Franco wants to sign up to the European communities and to the Treaty of Rome. There is nothing in the Treaty of Rome that prevented Franco's dictatorship from signing up. It's only later that these European communities discovered that they might have a conscience based on democracy and human rights, which was totally absent from the commercial agreements that founded it. So maybe indeed we should return to Versailles and to its great ambitions, which also means taking the right of self-determination seriously, including, that is, the right of the Ukrainian people to choose where they want to belong. They had made this choice in 1921, but it failed. They have made this choice in Euromaidan in 2014. And what did they receive from the European Union? Nothing. Not a single sign of hope, not a single concrete prospect that they could finally join this European family to which they want to belong, not in cultural or identity terms, but in terms of a political model of democracy and human rights. We did not offer them this hope, and in this way we somehow abandoned them once again to Russia. So yes, indeed, let's maybe rediscover the grand designs and the grand Europe of Versailles, of that Europe we dreamt about creating in 1919. We failed, but we should try again. And we should not settle for less. We should never settle for that small Europe of the 1950s, geographically small, but small in its ambitions too. I hope that visiting the battlefields of the Ypres salient will convince you more than ever of this. Thank you.
Bien, je vais commencer par réagir en français. Peter, tu nous avais promis une lecture provocative. Je vois qu'elle l'était au début, mais qu'elle l'est aussi à la fin. Et je t'en remercie. Donc, l'idée, vous l'avez bien comprise, c'est que vous allez visiter un champ de bataille et donc vous allez éprouver naturellement une émotion forte. Donc, l'idée de la conférence, c'est de contribuer d'une certaine manière à mettre en sens cette expérience, c'est-à-dire à la fois ce que vous allez éprouver et évidemment essayer de réfléchir sur ce qui s'est passé. Et donc, Peter, d'une certaine manière, nous livre un discours que je trouve provoquant au bon sens du terme, c'est-à-dire intellectuellement, parce qu'il est exigeant et il est en fait une leçon, je crois, sur la diversité qui nous caractérise et surtout sur la complexité du monde. Un historien classique aurait commencé par les origines de la guerre. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé ? Quelles étaient les responsabilités, etc. Je pense que toi, Peter, et c'est ce qui fait vraiment la force de ton discours, tu commences par les conflits de mémoire. Le sens de la guerre est un enjeu politique majeur. En Grande-Bretagne, en Flandre, en Pologne, enfin tu en as montré en France également, tu en as montré d'excellents exemples. Et donc, comme c'est un enjeu politique majeur, le sens de la guerre, c'est toujours quelque chose qui est aussi, et la mémoire de la guerre, potentiellement dangereux. La question de l'enjeu géopolitique que représentent les mémoires est au cœur, et tu l'as rappelé à la fin, de la guerre actuelle et de la guerre en Ukraine, quel que soit du reste du côté duquel on se situe. Mais surtout dans le cadre européen, parce qu'on est là pour réfléchir en européen, je pense que la question de la mémoire de la guerre, à la fois elle est très importante, et à la fois il faut toujours avoir en tête que c'est ce qu'on appelle une pomme de discorde. C'est un enjeu qui est vraiment sous tension. Donc je crois que la leçon, ou en tout cas l'une des leçon de cette leçon, parce que c'en est une, c'est qu'il faut à la fois être conscient de la guerre, de son désastre, mais si on veut la paix et la construction de l'Europe, il faut simultanément pratiquer cette opération intellectuelle de la réflexivité pour se déprendre, anticiper d'une certaine manière les autres lectures possibles de cette guerre. Sachant qu'autour d'une même table, en provenant avec des expériences différentes, des générations différentes, des nationalités différentes, eh bien précisément, on n'a pas nécessairement la même idée de la guerre. Nos mémoires sont pétries par nos histoires individuelles, familiales. Il n'y a pas, là, autant que nous sommes, dans toutes nos familles, des familles qui n'aient pas souffert de la Première Guerre. Et de la seconde, évidemment. Ce sont nos mémoires familiales, nos mémoires nationales, nos mémoires européennes, et sans être aussi provocateur, mais j'aurais quand même aussi envie de dire un peu européocentré. Si la guerre a été mondiale, ce n'est pas simplement parce que des gouvernements du monde y ont participé, c'est parce que des gens du monde sont morts dans les champs de bataille, en Flandre, en France, etc. Beaucoup d'Africains, des Américains aussi, des Australiens, etc. Et donc, c'est quelque chose à avoir en tête. Et d'une certaine manière, quand nous, à partir de notre petit point de vue, nous relisons cette histoire, peut-être nous avons tendance, nous aussi, très involontairement, mais à exclure et donc à fabriquer, d'une certaine manière, le terreau des guerres futures. Or, les morts n'ont pas de nationalité, on ne joue pas avec les morts, y compris quand il s'agit de faire de l'histoire. Et je pense que ton retour sur justement ces tensions historiographiques sont extrêmement importantes pour nous faire comprendre cette dimension et que d'une certaine manière nous mettions les émotions que nous allons vivre cet après-midi aussi dans cette perspective, dans cette distance. Donc le narratif de l'Europe et de la construction européenne, quelle que soit la vision qu'on puisse avoir de ces frontières, c'est à la fois être conscient du passé, de l'absurdité de la guerre, de son caractère destructeur, dévastateur, en vie, dans l'histoire des familles, mais aussi être conscient simultanément de la diversité de ses significations. Il faut faire toujours les deux. Et fort de cette réflexion, alors, inclure plutôt qu'exclure, et précisément essayer de regarder devant pour que cela ne recommence pas. Alors, vous allez poser des questions. J'ai envie d'en poser une un peu générale pour lancer le débat. C'est un peu, finalement, à quelles conditions ce patriotisme, ce qui pourrait être un équivalent d'une forme de patriotisme démocratique européen, enfin, si j'ai bien entendu ce que tu disais est possible, est-ce qu'il faut un nouveau Versailles? Est-ce que ça peut être une discussion qu'on peut avoir aussi vis-à-vis du traité de Rome? Est-ce qu'il ne fallait pas, à un moment donné, quand même, commencer aussi par l'économie pour essayer d'agir sur des leviers plutôt que sur des valeurs? C'est un débat qui est aujourd'hui, je crois, au cœur de la réflexion. Mais peut-être, Federica, tu vas intervenir sur cette question également.
Volontiers. Si je peux, je commence aussi. Pas avec une question, mais en effet avec un commentaire. So for language balances, I'll switch to English again. Or Italian or whatever. No Dutch. I tried, but I don't manage to learn. I would be much less provocative and probably much more mainstream, but probably I think this is actually the methodology of the college at its best. You hear something from which you learn. You also hear something from which you can have plenty of questions. For instance, what was it that made so many soldiers from so many different countries far away from here stay and die? Was it because they were afraid of being shot otherwise? Was it because of motivation? You will hear and you will live this somehow this afternoon. So you have probably here learned. You also have probably opened questions that stay in your mind. And maybe there are some points on which you might strongly disagree with. I have a couple, and I think this is the way to start a debate. And I think it would be great to have questions, but also comments from you on this. I think it's a good preparation for this afternoon visit. First and foremost, not because I'm from Rome, but let me defend the Treaty of Rome, and not for institutional duties of the past. But I strongly believe that actually the fact of not including the accountability element in the treaty that started the integration process. Personally, I believe that that was a political choice and even a wise one. And I think that starting from coal and steel was actually a very smart way to prevent war from happening again. Because when you share an economic interest, then you think twice before attacking your neighbor, because you share a self-interest. So you don't want to destroy the other's economy because you don't want to harm your own economy. So I think it was a very powerful, even if apparently not related to values, but I think it was a very powerful, maybe a bit cynical, but effective, I believe, instrument to promote those values, even without naming them. That has always been my reading. And also let me defend this, yes, probably because I was in office at the time. Let me defend what the European Union did for Ukraine after 2014. Could have been done more, yes, definitely yes, including the European perspective. But I believe that without the European Union support, the years after 2014 for Ukraine would have been much worse and much heavier and much more difficult than they have already been. And let's not forget, the European Union put in place, and still, obviously, actually even more now, has put in place the largest ever support package for any country in the world that the European Union has ever mobilized. So not only the sanctions, but also the active financial, but also reform agenda support. Obviously, it's never enough. But I think without that, probably Ukraine would have imploded, as probably Putin was hoping for much before this military invasion of this year. But I would probably have many other points on which I would comment and maybe argue. But I think it's now time for our students to take the floor. But thank you for a very stimulating, I think, inputs to our day.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, but respectfully, I'd like to disagree with your characterization of the First World War, of Ypres, and of the Men in Gate as being a symbol of British nationalism or values and patriotism. I think, whilst I agree that to some extent the Second World War and its memories have fueled a nationalist idea of British identity, the way that we learn about the First World War in the UK in schools and every year on the 11th of November, it is not something of British pride. It is about the horror of war, the pointless sacrifice of sons and brothers. It is about the idiocy and cruelty of asinine generals that sent men to their slaughter for some misguided, vacuous notion of king and country. And even the most celebrated First World War poem is that of Wilfred Owen, in which he concludes, "Dulce et decorum est pro patrium mori," that it is a lie, that it is a lie that it is sweet and noble to die for one's country. So, respectfully, I'd like to disagree with that characterization of a First World War memory in the UK.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. You promised to provoke us for the debate, and that was successful indeed. I think that there is no doubt that we have a history and we have a collective memory, which is also always a kind of choice of cherries we picked up from the tort and want to remember. And I have to agree with Professor Andrzej Nowak in the point that there is indeed kind of discrepancy between the memory of countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, maybe not Hungary, with what we have in Western Europe. And let's only say that a few years ago, the European Heritage Label was given to one of the cemeteries of Eastern Front in South Poland. And it's at all not a hot topic in collective memory in Poland at least. So let me ask, how would you suggest to deal with that, building kind of collective memory of European people? I think that from this very practical reason, the Second World War, which was a nightmare to all of people, is kind of more convenient basis to build on as a European integration is kind of answer to what happened during the war. But you argued that the First World War is also worth remembering. So please explain to us how do you suggest to unite those pretty different attitudes. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank you for the insightful presentation, but I noted, just like the professor, the quite glaring omission of mention of colonial troops, especially from Africa and India, as you mentioned. And I was wondering how far you think the Men in Gates goes in the sense of a site of cultural and historical reflection to serve the memories of those troops who were often forcibly taken from places on the other sides of the globe to fight a war that, as Jake mentioned, might not have any significance to their personal lives. So if you had a second at the end to comment on that, I think we'd be quite grateful. Thank you.
Je me permets de poser la question en français, ce sera pas...
Yeah, first of all, just thank you for your lecture. It was definitely very interesting. I just have two comments. First of all, I was the geek who read the Versailles Treaty. But I felt like in comparing the Treaty of Rome and the Versailles Treaty, I'd have to agree with the rector that, the Versailles Treaty was very utopian. And it was very forward-looking in its way, but we don't live in utopia, and it really didn't work. It was proven that it didn't work. It was too idealistic. I thought it was interesting that we had a picture of Wilson alongside Masaryk up on the PowerPoint there. And I mean, I would argue that maybe Wilson, it was the American government who drafted a lot of that, and while there was definitely good intentions, I didn't think it was I don't think he had a very good understanding of Europe at the time. And I felt like it led to a lot of the inherent weaknesses with Versailles. The Treaty of Rome, again, coal and steel being the two, I suppose, resources that were most needed for war production. The fact that that was a Franco-German initiative was really crucial. I would say, in terms of the Treaty of Rome and not being built on legacy, I would say if it's not broken, don't fix it. It worked. But to include political choice at the time would have been too controversial. It was better to build first the economic, I suppose, foundations, I guess, and then from there to go on. So I would argue that the Treaty of Rome would have been was a much better document, I suppose, than the Versailles Treaty, which had a lot of inherent weaknesses. And just in terms of a second comment there as well, I just thought it was very interesting, the comments about maybe how a lot of the Eastern European countries, just to build on what Yannick said earlier, like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and the Czechs as well, that their identity was sort of almost a creation. Now, it was certainly used by the Entente and the Central Powers to weaken the other side. That's definitely true. But to say that it was maybe an invention, I think is a bit of a step too far. The Estonian language, for example, existed before the Estonian-Soviet War in 1920. They were there, and I would argue that it was more the weakening of these big empires, and it allowed the nationalism, I guess, to flourish, and for these smaller nations to get self-determination in India, Ireland, Estonia, Poland. And I would argue that, yeah, there is something to celebrate in that. Out of the tragedy, there is definitely something to celebrate there. So, yeah, thank you.
Oui, donc tout d'abord, je me permets de poser la question en français, ce sera plus simple pour moi, je vais parler tranquillement. Donc merci pour votre propos, et en fait, il a fait écho à quelque chose qui m'intéresse pas mal, c'est la question des divisions des mémoires entre l'Est et l'Ouest, et notamment une résolution du Parlement européen qui a été adoptée il y a 3 ans de cela, il me semble en 2019, et qui avait été pas mal critiquée, notamment en France, mais également en Italie, notamment par David Sassoli, pour mettre sur le même plan les régimes nazis et soviétiques, et pour considérer que le pacte Molotov-Ribbentrop est comme point de départ de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Et donc à partir de ce fait, de cette polémique à l'Ouest et de la relative non-polémique à l'Est, ou plutôt de la volonté de justement mettre sur le même plan et de placer ce pacte comme point de départ de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Je voulais savoir qu'est-ce que vous préconisez pour avoir cette mémoire commune. Enfin, je me demande si ce que vous préconisez de revenir à Versailles, c'est pas un peu mettre sous le tapis cette différente construction Est-Ouest du fait de 45 ans de mur, et comment revenir à cette idée de nationalisme démocratique via Versailles peut vraiment cacher cette fragmentation. Est-ce que vous pensez de cela?
So if I want to answer all of this, I'm gone for another hour. So maybe just a bit rams and some points, and I apologize to those who didn't find what they expected in terms of an answer. I think it's important first to Mrs. Mogherini that, where are the responsibilities of Europe not living up to the expectations of the Ukrainian population in 2014? There's a tendency always to blame the European Union. No, it's the member states that are to blame. It is very explicitly France and the then president of France, and even more so, I was in Amsterdam this summer and I kept telling this to my Dutch friends who were a bit uneasy with it. It is the Dutch population who voted against it in a referendum. Okay, well, there were only 32% of the voters who participated in it. Well, even worse, there is collective responsibility in the Netherlands for closing the door to Ukraine. And that is the responsibility of member states. It is even the responsibility of electorates. It is not the responsibility of the individuals who were then in charge of the...
That was not my point.
No, but I know.
We'll discuss this later.
But I want to make this point, and I think this is also where we have to bring the debate, and precisely in, well, what should we do to promote some common European memories? This is not the 19th century where nation states invented national histories and national pedigrees. We are not going to repeat this and fabricate some common European history. We don't have to invent everything that unites us, but we have to find a language that is respectful of the different trajectories of different European nations. And that, I think, there is indeed a legitimate frustration in a country like Poland that basically West Europeans are uninterested in what happened in Poland and in what happened also in those parts who were occupied by the Soviet Union. We have to be inventive, not fabricate consensus where there can be none, but at least to find a common language and to listen and to try to have an inclusive history. In that regard, I think that indeed simply saying, well, it all started in Rome, and then if you want to join the club, you're free to join, but we are simply annexing you and you are adopting our narrative, is probably also part we have to abandon. Is the European Union of 2022 really the same thing that was created in the 1950s and that slowly grew? No, it has become something fundamentally different, and we have to take that into account, and we probably also have to challenge the narratives of genealogy of Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet and all that. This is a different story. It's part of the story. There's many other stories to be told. One recommendation one could have made to Vladimir Putin is never pick a fight you cannot win. Now, this is precisely what I did. Of course, you cannot say that Versailles was a better idea, the Treaty of Versailles, than the Treaty of Rome. On the one hand, we have the one thing that really worked. There are not many ideas in the 20th century that worked. European integration is one such thing. And if it worked, it's probably because it singularly lacked ambition. It was very modest in its ambitions, and this is why it worked. At the moment of Brexit and debates on what the European Union does wrong, I always defend with much vigor to all audiences, including my students, please quote me one other idea that worked so well as European integration did, including enlargement. Every single enlargement has been a huge success. So why should we stop doing something that worked? Just imagine we had admitted Turkey when we admitted Greece. Would we be where we are now? Just imagine we had really given concrete perspectives to Ukraine. Would we be where we are now? We know that European enlargement works. It's about the only thing in a planet that is in a desperate state. It's about the only thing that works. So let's defend it. So I said, of course, Versailles was a much better idea. It's maybe a bit of a cheap provocation. But still, I think we have to challenge the narratives that it all flowed from Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, and the 1950s to today, and that we also have to re-inject probably some utopia and some grand design. And the kind of small calculations that admitting be Turkey or Ukraine or whatever is going to cost us money, well, that is incompatible with grand designs. And in the end, indeed, just think of the alternative costs of non-enlargement. So let's re-inject some utopia in the way we envisage Europe. And this is what was there in Versailles, what might have contributed to its miserable failure. But it's not because something didn't work that we have to renounce once and forever of being utopian, of being ambitious, of including self-determination, democracy, and social rights in the construction of the political constructs that unite us all. Of course, I just try to take the opposite side and to say, okay, let's break with the kind narratives of World War I memory. And of course, the war poets. Of course, the war poets are anti-militarist, are pacifist, and contributed hugely to the deepening of a spirit of anti-militarism and democracy in France and Great Britain. That is absolutely crucial. That does not mean that all those who gather today at the Menin Gate are animated by the same ideas. So I just wanted to show that we can maybe have a more critical view than the kind of very consensual narrative. The more we talk about the Great War and the more we talk about the Second World War and the better citizens and the more peaceful we will become. It's a bit more complicated than that. Especially, let's not forget that if there is one man who talks incessantly about the memory of the war, and especially the Second World War, it's Vladimir Putin. That is what justifies his invasion. So an excess of memory can indeed be more harmful than maybe sometimes putting the past behind it. Colonial soldiers deserves a lecture on its own. In Flanders Fields Museum have regularly staged expositions, especially for colonial soldiers. I think there has been a huge amount of interest for colonial soldiers the last decade, and it's an incredibly stimulating and fascinating historiography, but I'm afraid I cannot go much further within the time that we have been allotted.
Okay, so thank you. So we stop on this message because they have buses to take and maybe to eat before.
So I apologize to all those who couldn't ask questions and to those I didn't really answer.
Maybe next time. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.